first speaker is Sondra Hale, and she's a professor of anthropology and women's studies at UCLA. She's also the co-founder and ex-co-editor of the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, and she's also the ex-co-chair of Islamic Studies and the former chair of Women's Studies. She's taught in a number of places, including our own beloved Cal State Northridge. She's published Gender and Politics in Sudan, which is also published in Arabic, and has done a number of articles and book chapters on gendered conflict and genocide, social movements, international gender studies, the politics of memory, and diaspora studies. So please welcome Dr. Hale.
The goals of initiatives such as this one in front of us, among the goals is to contribute broadly to the transformation of our fields intellectually, pedagogically, academically, institutionally, and to attempt to build cosmopolitan and transnational research projects and curricula, student body, and faculty. Now, one of my fields is gender studies, as you can see from the program, and feminist research. I've offered only one course on the Middle East through anthropology. The course is called The Cultural Area of the Middle East. My colleague Susan Slimovich now teaches that course. The reasons why I don't teach it anymore are complex, but after 9/11, I figured that it would be an extremely difficult class to teach. And Susan joined the UCLA faculty about that time. And so she's teaching it now, and I'm so happy she's teaching it. Anyway, when I taught it, it was highly gendered, and I'm sure it's highly gendered when Susan teaches it as well. We have a lot of overlap. But she's going to talk about anthropology, and so I will focus on gender studies. Impossible in my world to separate them, but I'll try. I teach at least some portion about gender dynamics in the Middle East in all of my classes, but especially in my undergraduate course, Women in Social Movements, and in my graduate seminar on post-colonial theories and also women in conflict zones. So all of these have a very high content of Middle Eastern, North African, and Muslim women. Now, I center gender in almost all the courses that I teach, and a number of us who do feminist research and work in gender studies do, in fact, center gender and women. But I'd like to pose a question about that, about why many of us in Middle East studies and Islamic studies now tend to center gender studies in our teaching. Perhaps for all the wrong reasons, and perhaps for all the right reasons. We could ask, isn't that simply playing into the notion of the exceptionalism of Middle Eastern women, an approach that many of us claim to work against? No, we could argue, because we end up teaching against the grain of what most of our students enter the classroom thinking about Middle Eastern and Muslim women, that they're poor, simple, uneducated, downtrodden, veiled and secluded, oppressed, and ruled by men and religion. Or that they are exotic, alluring, hypersexual. So we teachers have to spend a lot of time and energy breaking down these kinds of stereotypes. However, at the same time that many of us in Euro-American gender studies are rubbing against the grain of received and deeply embedded ideas that get revealed in the U.S. classroom, we are also, at the same time, responding to the challenges offered to us by our colleagues, the scholars in the Middle East, North Africa, and other Muslim areas. Challenges that pretty much symbolize the troubled relationships of so-called Western versus Middle East Islamism. For more than 3 decades, scholars in the Middle Eastern and North African studies, or MENA, and Islamic studies have discussed the Orientalist design that posits women as the cultural icon or symbol of Middle Eastern and Islamic society. In other words, the East-West dichotomy has been a distinctly gendered model. In effect, women and gender have been key to the way in which the global North has conceptualized MENA and the Muslim worlds. I wrote about it as early as 1989 and others even earlier than that. Dominant within women's studies and research in the global North is the underlying notion of Middle Eastern studies as being exceptional to feminist studies. And Middle East exceptionalism has often been linked to the overprivileging of Islam, partially a result of the strong link in the Western imaginary made between Islam and women. Orientalist design has spilled over into Muslim communities throughout the world. Although there's no time, really, in this brief paper to talk about some of the historical factors behind these attitudes, it's instructional to read a statement by Laura Nader from 1989. She presents a methodology for examining the Western colonial frame as it subordinates its own women through a critique of the women of the other, which is not an unusual method, strategy, or whatever that we see in many societies. That is, one part of it is the way to get at the men of a particular society is to get at the women. But she's saying something slightly different. She argues that, and she's using both Gramsci and Edward Said, she argues that critique of the other may be an instrument of control when the comparison asserts a positional superiority. That's a Gramsci term. The questions are twofold, she says. How does the critique of the other operate as a key to the process by which civilizations and nation-states control their women and the women of other cultures? Two, still Laura Nader, how are the dynamics of male dogma controlled by notions that women's place vis-a-vis men improves with the development of civilization, or the contrary view, that the higher the civilization, I hate that word, but she's using it, the higher the civilization, the increased ascendancy of men. These two questions, again, still Nader, these two questions will combine to address the dynamics of male dogma operating in contemporary and interacting world systems. How could images of women in other cultures act as a control to women in one's own society? So anytime there are crises going on especially with regard to sexuality in the United States, I can always predict that there will be an increase of critiques of women of other societies. And for the last few decades, it's been the role of women in Middle Eastern societies. In the recent past, various theoretical, ideological, and methodological elements have joined forces and have combined the consideration of Middle Eastern women to a limited discussion of veiling or dress, honor and shame, kinship and family, polygamy, and Islam. And Suad Joseph talked about this as early as 1983. And although this is changing because of the progressive scholars now working in these areas of research, still the general Orientalist paradigms persist. The following question is among our research and teaching challenges. How to teach against the grain of Orientalism without invisibilizing the real problems of Muslim and Middle Eastern women that they themselves point out. And basically that means, in my case, that I could give two very different talks to an American audience. I talk very differently about this when I'm in Sudan, which is my main research area, or almost any other place in the Middle East or Muslim Africa. Somehow our teaching about gender in the Middle East and in Muslim communities has to reach students with little or no background, in many cases even if they are of Middle Eastern descent, and still contribute to the ongoing philosophical and epistemological debates in and about the Middle East and Muslim communities. In other words, the job is pretty much impossible. Let me talk about the timing of an initiative of this sort, or the timing of teaching about the Middle East or forming Middle East studies centers, etc. It's a very propitious time, as we could figure out, in a number of ways. The political climate beckons us. the events of 9/11 and the subsequent momentous developments that took place between and within the U.S. and countries of the MENA region and other dominantly Muslim states, Pakistan, Afghanistan. It makes this program that's being put on the ground not only significant but urgent. Another critical development was the publication in 2002 by the United Nations, the UN Development Programme's Arab Human Development Report, which identified the status of women as one of the main gaps for the Arab region. A second major gap that the report identified was education. The report authors calling for, quote, a radical revision of education systems in Arab countries. The report caused a lot of debates, was cited widely, and became very important. It's a further propitious time because of the so-called Arab Spring. I shouldn't say so-called, I should say partial Arab Spring. A series of uprisings that have highlighted not only the potential for grassroots movements, but the participation of women in these. Also highlighted, the flip side of it, has been the struggle that these same women face in the post-dictator era of having a role in the building of new democracies. Also a word I'm skeptical of. One of the things that I was suggesting is that we should try to develop these initiatives with the help of people from the area. And I don't mean people living here now, although that's fine, but I mean trying to have video conferences, exchanging syllabi and so on to see how gender studies is taught in the areas that we're teaching, understanding all along that there are very different contexts and so on.